The first thing that always came to mind when thinking about that place was how carefully it was designed to remove uncertainty. How every road, every fence line, every building and schedule existed to reduce the chance of surprise to almost nothing. And that was why the small inconsistencies of that evening were so difficult to dismiss. Because they did not arrive as a single obvious problem, but as a collection of minor details that each seemed harmless on its own. The kind of things that would normally be blamed on fatigue or inattention, except that they kept repeating in ways that did not quite line up. The sun went down behind the tree line at the usual hour, but the shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, stretching across the pavement in shapes that did not quite match the buildings that cast them. And the lights along the main road flickered on in their usual sequence, except one that hesitated for several seconds before joining the rest, leaving a brief pocket of dimness that felt oddly deliberate. Inside, the air carried the familiar mix of dust, metal, and cleaning solution, but there was also something flatter to it, as if the space had been closed too long, even though doors were opening and closing as they always did, and people moved through the corridors with the same steady, unhurried purpose that defined every evening. Yet clocks disagreed in small ways that no one could immediately explain. A wall clock running a minute fast, a watch stubbornly slow, a digital display near the entrance blinking as if it had recently lost power, even though nothing else suggested an outage. And when someone adjusted one of them, it would drift back again within the hour. Not enough to cause a problem, just enough to be noticed twice. Outside, a truck that was expected to pass by at a certain time arrived early. Then another arrived late, and the space between them felt longer than it should have been, filled with a quiet that did not belong to any scheduled break. There were also small lapses in routine that were harder to explain. A door found unlocked that was always locked. A storage room light left on, even though no one could remember using it. A name on a clipboard that did not match the assignment written beside it. And when these things were pointed out, they were corrected with a kind of casual efficiency, as if the corrections themselves were more important than understanding how the errors had appeared. The most unsettling part was not that these things happened, but that they happened without producing any real reaction, as though the entire place had decided, without ever agreeing to it, that minor contradictions were simply part of the background now. Even the sounds seemed slightly out of step, footsteps echoing in hallways that should have absorbed them. A distant engine idling for too long before fading away. A brief rush of wind moving through the trees that arrived on a perfectly still night and left no movement behind. By the time the evening settled fully into darkness, everything appeared to be back in order. Lights steady, doors secured, schedules apparently intact. Yet the sense of misalignment remained, not as fear or alarm, but as a quiet, persistent impression that the base was continuing to function while something underneath its surface had shifted by a small, unmeasured amount, and no one could quite say when that shift had begun. Asterisk by the second day. The strange details from the previous evening had not disappeared, but instead seemed to have settled into the routine as if they had always been there. And that was what made them harder to talk about, because nothing about them felt urgent enough to justify stopping the machinery of the place. The schedules were still posted, the gates still opened and closed, and the flow of work continued with the same steady rhythm. Yet the small disagreements between clocks had grown slightly wider, not enough to cause missed duties, but enough that two people could check the time in the same room and come away with different answers, without either of them being wrong. A notice that had been pinned to a board near the main corridor appeared to have been moved a few inches to the left, though no one remembered doing it, and when it was straightened again, it was found the next morning in almost the same wrong position, as if it had been carefully returned there. Outside, tire marks appeared on a stretch of pavement that had not been used overnight, and the marks did not lead clearly in or out, but instead faded in both directions, ending in places where there was no obvious reason for a vehicle to have turned. Inside, a storage log showed an item signed out and signed back in at times that overlapped in a way that should have been impossible. And when the entry was checked against other records, none of them agreed with each other, though each one looked perfectly ordinary on its own. People began to notice that they were having the same small conversation more than once, not in a dramatic way, but with the faint discomfort of realizing halfway through a sentence that they had already said these words before, perhaps earlier that day, perhaps the day before, and that the other person seemed just as unsure about it. What made this harder to dismiss was the way the building itself seemed to respond, or perhaps failed to respond to these inconsistencies. Because sounds carried in odd ways, sometimes arriving too late, sometimes too clearly, and doors that should have muffled footsteps allowed them to echo as if the corridors were longer than they were. In one office, a light was found switched on in the morning, even though the room had been locked the night before. And in another, a light that was always left on was dark, its switch still in the same position. And when it was flipped off and on again, it worked normally, as if nothing had happened. The air felt heavier in certain hallways, not in a way that could be measured, but in the way people slowed down without realizing why, pausing for a moment longer at corners, hesitating before opening doors, and then moving on without comment. No one could point to a single cause or even a single moment when things had started to drift, and that uncertainty made it easier to ignore, because it did not present itself as a problem to be solved, only as a series of small, quiet disagreements between how the place was supposed to work and how it actually did. And by the end of the second day, the most troubling realization was not that something was wrong, but that it was becoming normal. Asterisk by the third day. The sense that something was quietly arranging itself beneath the ordinary surface of the base had become difficult to ignore, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because the same small irregularities were now appearing in places they should never have been touched by chance, and the repetition of them began to feel deliberate in a way that no one wanted to name. It started with the records, which were usually treated as the final authority on what had occurred and when. Yet now they disagreed with one another in subtle, careful ways, as if each document were telling a version of the same story that had been copied from memory rather than from fact. A maintenance report listed a routine inspection as having taken place at a time when the area had been closed, and another report placed the same inspection 2 hours later with the same signature, written in the same ink, but pressed slightly harder into the paper. And when both were brought together, they were set aside rather than corrected, not because anyone thought they were right, but because no one could say which one was wrong. In the corridors, people began to notice that they were passing the same faces more often than seemed reasonable, not in a friendly or familiar way, but with the strange impression of having already seen someone in a place where they could not possibly have been, and then seeing them again as if nothing unusual had happened. Some began to realize that they were taking slightly different routes without meaning to, turning down hallways they did not usually use, and only later noticing that they could not remember why they had chosen them in the first place. The buildings themselves seemed to offer more space than they should have, with storage rooms that felt deeper, stairwells that took a few more steps than memory suggested, and doorways that opened onto areas that were correct in every detail, but still felt faintly unfamiliar, as if they had been rebuilt overnight to match a description rather than a plan. Outside, the pattern continued in quieter ways, with the same stretch of ground appearing more worn in the morning and less so by evening, as though use and rest were no longer following the same order. And a line of trees near the perimeter fence began to show the same small disturbances in the soil beneath them. repeated in a way that suggested careful movement rather than weather or animals. Sounds, too, began to arrive in the wrong sequence. A distant engine heard before it could be seen. Footsteps echoing after the person had already passed. A door closing somewhere that no one could quite locate. And these things were usually followed by a pause. A moment when several people would stop at once and listen, then continue as if nothing had interrupted them. The most unsettling change, however, was in memory itself, because people began to notice gaps that were not large enough to be alarming, but were too precise to ignore. Small stretches of time that could not be accounted for, yet left behind the sense of having been occupied. And when they tried to reconstruct those missing moments, they found only ordinary details arranged in the wrong order, like a room tidied by someone who did not know where anything belonged. By the end of the third day, it was no longer just a collection of coincidences or clerical errors, but a pattern that existed mostly in the spaces between things. And the quiet understanding had begun to settle in that whatever was happening did not need to announce itself, because it was already woven into the routine. And the routine was continuing without ever stopping to ask, why ? By the fourth day. Attempts to bring order back to the quiet confusion only seemed to make the shape of it more noticeable, as though the act of checking and rechecking was revealing how little agreement there was between the things that were supposed to confirm each other. People compared logs, schedules, and sign-in sheets, and each one appeared reasonable when viewed alone. Yet when laid side by side, they refused to line up, with times that overlapped in impossible ways, and names that appeared in places they could not have been. And even when an effort was made to trace a simple sequence of events, the trail would break into 2 or 3 equally plausible versions before reaching its end. A hallway camera that was reviewed to settle a minor question showed nothing unusual at first, only the expected empty corridor, but when the same footage was watched again a few hours later, there was a brief stretch where the lighting changed slightly without any visible cause. Not enough to suggest a malfunction, just enough to suggest that something had passed through the space without leaving a clear outline. In another building, a door was found open that should have been sealed, and the record of its access showed a clean, ordinary entry at a time when no one could remember being there. And when the time was checked against other records, it matched some and contradicted others, as if the system itself had begun to treat time as a suggestion rather than a rule. The effort to reconcile these things produced a new kind of unease, because it became clear that the problem was not that information was missing, but that there was too much of it, and that it formed patterns only when viewed from a distance, never when examined closely. As the day went on, the physical spaces began to feel less cooperative, not in any dramatic way, but in the way that makes a person second-guess their own sense of direction, with familiar routes taking slightly longer and corners arriving a step later than expected. And more than one person found themselves stopping in front of a door, certain they had just come through it, yet unable to remember doing so. Conversations, too, developed a strange circular quality, with questions being asked, answered, and then asked again, as if the answers had slipped away in the space between sentences. And no one could be sure whether this was forgetfulness or something more subtle, because the missing pieces were never the important ones, only the small connective details that made events feel continuous. Outside, the same quiet marks near the perimeter appeared again, slightly rearranged but unmistakably similar. And when they were photographed and compared, the differences were precise enough to suggest intention without ever revealing a purpose. The air in certain areas felt still in a way that was hard to describe, as if movement passed through it without quite disturbing it. And in those places, people found themselves lowering their voices or slowing their steps without being able to explain why. By the end of the fourth day, the effort to verify what was happening had only deepened the sense that the base was no longer agreeing with itself. that records, memories, and spaces were all continuing forward on slightly different paths, and that whatever was causing this did not need to hide, because it was already present in every attempt to prove that nothing unusual was going on at all. Asterisk, by the fifth day, the idea that the situation might correct itself had quietly faded, not because anything openly threatening had occurred, but because the number of small, unresolved contradictions had grown to the point where moving through the base felt like walking across a surface that no longer fully supported its own weight. People continued to follow their assignments, but they did so with a new, careful attention, checking the same details more than once and pausing in places where there had never been any reason to pause before. And even then the same gentle distortions persisted. A room that seemed to have been used and then unused in the same stretch of time. A report that could be traced back through 3 offices and still did not clearly originate anywhere. A vehicle that appeared on one list and not on another, yet was plainly visible in the lot. The most unsettling change was not in the systems or the buildings, but in the way people began to move, because there was now a shared, unspoken understanding that certain areas felt wrong. Not dangerous in any obvious sense, but quietly resistant, as if they did not quite belong to the rest of the place anymore. In those corridors, footsteps seemed to lose their echo, and voices carried poorly, and more than one person reported the odd sensation of reaching a doorway and feeling, for no clear reason, that stepping through it would mean arriving somewhere slightly different from where they expected. Attempts were made to mark these areas, to note them in the same careful way everything else was noted, but the markings did not always remain where they were placed, and the notes that referred to them developed the same small disagreements in time and detail that had begun to affect everything else. Memory, too, became less dependable in ways that were harder to dismiss, because it was no longer just a matter of not recalling certain moments, but of recalling them in forms that could not all be true at once, with 2 people remembering the same routine task being completed in different orders, or a short meeting being remembered as having happened in 2 different rooms, both described with equal certainty and equal detail. The gaps were still small, still polite, still easy to explain away if one tried hard enough, but they were now too frequent to ignore, and they left behind a faint sense of having been interrupted without ever noticing the interruption itself. Outside, the same quiet disturbances along the perimeter appeared again, and this time they were accompanied by a subtle change in the way the nearby trees leaned, not as if pushed or broken, but as if something had passed between them, and they had slowly settled back into place. Late in the day, a brief interruption in power affected only a narrow section of the base, and when it came back, all the systems in that area restarted normally, yet the clocks, they were out of step in a way that could not be fully corrected, drifting back into disagreement no matter how carefully they were adjusted. By then, it had become impossible to pretend that this was just a series of unrelated errors, and yet there was still nothing that could be pointed to as the cause. Only the growing certainty that the place was no longer entirely following the same sequence of moments as the people inside it, and that whatever had begun as a slight misalignment had now become something that could not be stepped around, only lived with, as the base continued to function in a way that looked normal from a distance and felt quietly, persistently wrong from within. By the 6th day, the base appeared, at least on the surface, to have settled back into something that resembled its old rhythm, and that was what made the remaining unease so difficult to explain. Because the lights came on when they were supposed to, the gates opened and closed on time, and the schedules no longer showed the obvious, overlapping contradictions that had drawn so much quiet attention in the days before. Yet the sense of misalignment had not gone away so much as it had thinned out and spread, becoming something that lived in the background rather than in any single, identifiable problem. People moved through their routines with a careful calm that was almost deliberate, as if everyone had agreed, without speaking, that it was better not to test the edges of things. And even the areas that had felt resistant before now allowed passage without any obvious hesitation, though they retained a faint, empty quality, like rooms that had been aired out after holding a smell that no one could quite remember. Records had been adjusted, clocks had been synchronized again, and the small marks and notes that had tried to map the strange changes were either removed or quietly forgotten. And if someone went looking for them later, they would find only clean surfaces and ordinary paperwork, arranged in a way that suggested nothing unusual had ever been there. And yet, memory did not quite follow the same correction, because people still found themselves pausing in the middle of familiar tasks, uncertain whether they were finishing something or starting it. And sometimes two people would share a brief look of recognition, the kind that comes from realizing that the other person has noticed the same small absence, even if neither of them could say what was missing. Outside, the ground near the perimeter looked undisturbed again, and the trees stood in their usual lines. But there was a subtle difference in the way the area felt, not as if something were present, but as if something had passed through and left no clear trace except a slight uncertainty about how it had done so. The clocks that had refused to stay aligned now held their time more faithfully, yet some people continued to check them twice, or to compare them against one another, without quite knowing why. And a few noticed that their own watches seemed to have gained or lost a small amount of time that could not be accounted for, though it was never enough to prove anything. The most unsettling part was how quickly the place began to accept this new normal, how easily the days before were filed away as a period of minor confusion, a run of errors that had been corrected, even as the quiet gaps in memory remained, small enough to live with, too small to justify reopening the questions that had no clear answers. From a distance, nothing had changed, and even from close up, it was difficult to point to anything that was still wrong. But there was a lingering impression, shared by more than a few, that the base was now continuing from a point that did not quite connect to what came before, like a story that had lost a page in the middle and kept going anyway, long after the routines had fully stabilized, and long after the record showed only ordinary days. That sense remained, not as fear, but as a quiet awareness that something had moved through the place, altered it in a way that could not be fully measured, and then left, taking with it whatever explanation might once have made the whole sequence of days fit together into a single, uninterrupted line.